What if everything you thought about the Victorian era was wrong? What if their obsession with death was darker than you could ever imagine? Behind the lace and candlelight were secrets that would chill even modern minds. From morbid photo ops to seances with the dead, their rituals were far from romantic. And one truth buried with the dead was only uncovered in the modern age. That one you'll need to wait until the final chapter to see. But before we dive in, let me know if you're enjoying this kind of long, gentle history. Feel free to tap that like button and subscribe, only if you truly love what I'm doing here. And in the comments, share where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your city. I always love seeing our little bedtime crew gathering from every corner of the world. Now lower your lights, maybe let a soft fan hum in the background, and settle in. Let's ease into tonight's quiet journey together. Chapter 1: The Business of Dying, How Victorians Commercialized Grief. In the Victorian age, death wasn't just a tragedy, it was a business. The moment someone passed away, an entire machinery of profit clicked into motion. Families scrambled to prove their sorrow, not only through emotion but through the cost of mourning. If grief could be measured, it was weighed in silk, measured in inches of black lace, and tallied by how many carriages followed the coffin. Undertakers became status advisors, guiding families through catalogs of options. Coffins with velvet lining, hearses drawn by specially bred black horses, and mourning attire that adhered to a strict social calendar. There were rules for how long a widow should wear black and penalties, in shame and whispers, for failing to comply. But behind the somber appearances were merchants ready to squeeze profit from every tear. This wasn't just mourning, it was theater, and every grieving household became a stage where sorrow was both performed and paid for. The moment death knocked on a Victorian door, tradesmen followed. There were fabric merchants offering yards of jet-black crepe. Milliners supplied mourning bonnets stitched with meaning. Drapers covered mirrors and windows in thick mourning cloth, transforming even the light itself into gloom. But the most essential figure in this play of grief was the undertaker. Not just a handler of bodies, he was a curator of status. His office resembled a showroom, complete with coffin samples, fabric swatches, and service packages tailored to one's class. For the wealthy, these packages included elaborate floral arrangements, hired mourners in uniform, and carriages for guests. But even the poor were pressured to spend more than they could afford, because in Victorian society, how you buried the dead defined who you were among the living. Funerals became ceremonies of social competition. People didn't just attend out of respect, they judged. Was the coffin lined with lead? Were the mourners dressed appropriately? Did the procession block traffic, slow enough to be noticed but dignified enough not to disrupt? Everything was calculated to display loss, and yet subtly whisper of wealth. The deeper the grief, the more elaborate the tribute. Some families who couldn't afford full mourning still found ways to signal their sorrow, selling heirlooms, going into debt, or borrowing funeral clothing to wear just for the event. The shame of a poor funeral lasted far longer than the loss itself. For many, mourning wasn't just a ritual, it was survival. A poorly executed funeral could damage a family's reputation beyond repair. Even jewelry was crafted from the pain of parting. Mourning rings embedded with the deceased's name, birth, and death dates became common. But the most intimate form of remembrance was hair jewelry. Strands of the departed's hair were woven into bracelets, brooches, and even tiny braided landscapes under glass. These were wearable griefs worn close to the skin. Vendors sold kits so families could create their own keepsakes, while luxury artisans offered intricate designs at steep prices. To possess such a piece wasn't just sentimental, it was fashionable. Magazines published mourning etiquette guides and hairwork patterns, treating grief as a craft to be mastered. Death was no longer a sudden end, it was a season, and it came with trends, fads, and fashion statements that changed year to year. Mourning fashion followed rigid codes, especially for women. A widow, for example, entered a stage called deep mourning, where she could wear nothing but matte black, no jewelry, and a heavy veil that nearly concealed her face. This lasted a year and a day. Then came second mourning, when small adornments were allowed. By half mourning, grays and purples were permitted. But to abandon these stages too quickly was seen as scandalous. There were whispers of women being shunned at parties or church for appearing in color too soon after a husband's death. These time frames weren't just tradition, they were societal checkpoints monitored by neighbors, clergy, and relatives. The entire community enforced this timetable of sadness, and clothing became a public declaration of inner suffering, regardless of whether that suffering was genuine. Behind the black curtains and somber garments were industries thriving on grief. Mourning warehouses operated in London like department stores of death. Customers browsed rows of ready-to-wear mourning outfits or hired specialists to tailor garments overnight in cases of sudden loss. Some shops even offered rental mourning clothes for those who couldn't afford to buy. There were catalogs filled with mourning stationery, funeral invites edged in black, and return cards for condolences. Every moment of grief was monetized, packaged, and sold. For a price, you could buy sorrow by the yard. The wealthy viewed it as duty. The poor viewed it as necessity. But few escaped the trap, because if you failed to mourn correctly, you risked being seen as cold, uncaring, or worse, improper. Even children weren't exempt from these expectations. Young girls wore black ribbons, bonnets, and gloves. Boys dressed in miniature mourning suits, sometimes too large for their bodies, making them look like shrunken adults in grief's costume. Children were expected to participate in the rituals, to cry at the right times, and to be silent when grown-ups spoke of the deceased. Portraits were taken of entire families in mourning attire, seated solemnly, surrounded by symbols of death. In these images, children clutched prayer books or posed beside urns. These weren't just family keepsakes, they were proofs of propriety. It wasn't enough to grieve. One had to show that grief was performed correctly, from cradle to grave, for every member of the household. As mourning became more commercial, even roles emerged for hired mourners. These were individuals paid to cry, wail, and fill the silence of funerals where family or emotion was scarce. Rooted in older traditions but refined during the Victorian period, these mourners were often women who specialized in exaggerated displays of sadness. They wore black from head to toe and walked behind the hearse with practiced despair. Their presence added weight to the ceremony, making the deceased appear more beloved. For the right price, one could borrow not only sorrow but status. In this way, even tears could be bought, and no one questioned their authenticity. After all, in a world where mourning was public spectacle, who could tell the real grief from the rehearsed? Undertakers, once humble tradesmen, evolved into orchestrators of an entire theatrical production. They offered packages like wedding planners, only the occasion was loss. Some offered multiple coffin choices, each tiered by price and luxury. Want a coffin made of oak with brass handles and velvet lining? That was extra. Did the family want the body embalmed, displayed, or transported across the country by train? There were fees for each detail. Embalming itself became an upsell, popularized during the later half of the century, allowing families to delay burial for weeks. This made extended viewing periods possible, but also created new hazards. If not done properly, the embalmed could rot from the inside, all while wearing their best black. There were even death announcements in newspapers, paid notices that declared the loss with appropriate language and flowery prose. Families competed for the most poetic tributes, carefully crafted to evoke emotion while upholding their social image. These obituaries weren't just announcements. They were advertisements for the family's refinement and taste. The phrasing mattered. The choice of fonts and even border width conveyed messages about the family's stature. Mourning became a language only the well-versed could speak. If you didn't know how to play the game, you risked being left out, forgotten in life and disrespected in death. But not everyone could afford to keep up with these expectations. For the working class, the burden of mourning often meant choosing between food and funeral. Some families took out burial insurance, paying small amounts each week to ensure they could afford a decent send-off. Others relied on savings clubs or parish aid. Still, many faced humiliation when their grief couldn't meet the visual standards set by wealthier families. There were stories of families hiring carriages for just the first stretch of the funeral procession, then switching to handcarts once out of public view. These were desperate measures taken to preserve dignity in a system designed to exploit it. At the core of it all was a society obsessed with death not because it was sacred, but because it was public. The Victorian age taught people to mourn out loud, to spend lavishly, and to follow rituals like choreography. But the sorrow that truly mattered, the quiet ache of loss, the private longing, was often drowned in velvet and gold. By turning mourning into an economy, the Victorians created a world where grief became a competition and sincerity was easily outbid. The undertakers didn't just bury the dead. They buried authenticity beneath layers of etiquette and expense. And in that silent exchange between sorrow and spectacle, something truly human was lost. Chapter 2: Post-Mortem Photography. Why they took portraits of corpses. In the soft flicker of gaslight, a child's body was gently arranged on a velvet chair. Her eyes, painted delicately shut, gave the illusion of peaceful slumber. A mother adjusted her own dress, wiped away a tear, and sat beside the lifeless form. The photographer, already familiar with such scenes, focused the camera and waited. Moments later, a haunting image was captured, not of the living, but of the dead. In Victorian society, death was not hidden. It was documented, and post-mortem photography became one of the most intimate ways to remember those lost. Families, clinging to memory, invited death into their albums, their homes, their very hands. For many, it was the only photograph they would ever have of their child, their spouse, their sibling. The dead, preserved in stillness, became a permanent part of the family portrait. These photographs were not merely clinical. They were artful, staged, and often indistinguishable from portraits of the living. Photographers would prop the deceased in lifelike poses, sitting in a chair, reclining on a chaise, even standing with support from hidden braces or wires. Limbs were carefully arranged to suggest vitality. Eyes were sometimes painted onto closed eyelids or enhanced in the developed image to create the illusion of alertness. In cases of children, props like toys, blankets, or dolls were placed in their arms, reinforcing the idea that the child was simply sleeping. And to a grieving parent, that illusion brought comfort. The photographs did not speak of rot or finality. They whispered of eternal rest, a slumber that never ended, preserved in sepia tones and silvered glass. Post-mortem photography found its place not only in the upper classes but in middle and working class homes. While the rich had oil paintings and sculpted busts, the rising availability of photography meant that even modest families could afford a portrait of their lost loved one. Photographers advertised their services openly, some specializing in this grim but necessary trade. Studios developed techniques to conceal decay, retouch faces, and hide the signs of death. In some towns, photographers would travel house to house, arriving discreetly after a death. They came with their own drapes and furniture, creating a somber backdrop regardless of the family's means. The death portrait became not just a memento, it became a ritual, one more task in the long checklist of mourning. These portraits were not always taken with honesty. In some cases, family members were unaware they had posed with the dead. A child might be told to hold their brother's hand or sit beside their sister without knowing the truth. In the final photograph, the living and the dead would appear equally still, equally composed. This blurred line between death and life spoke to deeper Victorian fears and fascinations. Death was both a moment and a mystery, and photography became a bridge between two worlds. Captured the exact line where breath stopped, but memory began. To own such a photo was to defy time itself. But that defiance came at a cost. Photographers had to work quickly. Decomposition waited for no one. In warmer months, ice had to be used to preserve bodies long enough for the photo session. Windows were kept open, fans turned on, an entire household silenced during the delicate procedure. The camera required long exposure times. The living had to remain perfectly still, and the dead, well, they posed best of all. But despite this, challenges remained. Bodies could stiffen in unnatural ways. Limbs would droop, eyes sink, and skin take on a waxy hue. Photographers often retouched the final prints by hand, painting over flaws or adding touches to restore the illusion of life. Some added color to the cheeks or shadows beneath the lashes. The final result was not a photo of death. It was an image of denial. In some images, entire families surrounded the deceased. A mother cradling a lifeless infant. Siblings gathered around an older brother, as if merely paying quiet respect. Occasionally, even pets were included. These photographs were placed in family albums without shame. Visitors to the home might be shown the image during tea, the same way someone today might show a wedding picture. It wasn't considered macabre. It was considered love. The Victorians did not hide from death. They posed with it, honored it, and shared it openly. These portraits served as proof that the lost were still remembered, still part of the family narrative. They were not erased, they were framed. Children were the most common subjects of post-mortem photography. High child mortality rates made early death a grim expectation. A photograph of a child in life was rare. Most families could not afford such luxuries while the child was still breathing. But in death, suddenly the funds were found. Photographers offered packages specifically for infant portraits. Some images showed children laid on beds of flowers, nestled in tiny coffins, or held by grieving mothers. Others depicted them in baptismal gowns or Sunday best, as if preparing for one final celebration. These photos served as both farewell and proof that the child had existed, had been loved, and would not be forgotten. In a time when grief was private but performative, such images told the world that mourning had been done properly. But not all post-mortem photos were taken at home. Some bodies were brought to studios, hidden under shawls or cloaks, moved through alleys and back doors. These studios had props and furniture tailored for such sessions. High-backed chairs with armrests that could hold weight, stands to support limbs, and backdrops of drawn curtains or stained glass. Lighting was arranged to soften harsh features, and photographers kept lavender oil or vinegar nearby to mask the smell of decay. There was a rhythm to this business, a cold efficiency layered beneath the gentleness. The camera did not discriminate between pulse and stillness. It only captured shadows and light. Sometimes the photos carried strange energies. Tales circulated of images that seemed too lifelike. Eyes that appeared to follow the viewer. Smiles that seemed to deepen with time. Whether these were tricks of light or tricks of grief, no one could say. But some families began treating these images as sacred, placing them in locked boxes or behind curtains. Others swore they felt the presence of the dead more strongly near the photograph. Mediums sometimes used them during seances, believing the image helped anchor the spirit. In this way, post-mortem photography blurred again into the spiritual, another tool in the Victorian quest to connect with the beyond. As technology evolved, so did the practice. Cabinet cards and daguerreotypes gave way to newer methods, but the tradition slowly faded. By the early 20th century, post-mortem photography had become taboo, seen as eerie or inappropriate. But in the Victorian world, it was the opposite. It was love transformed into image. It was evidence of a bond that even death could not sever. And it was, above all, a product of a society that feared forgetting far more than it feared death itself. These images were meant to outlive memory, to speak when the living could no longer describe the lost. But there were darker corners to this tradition. Some photographers, driven by profit or demand, crossed ethical lines. Bodies of the unclaimed poor were photographed and sold as curiosities. Some studios reused props, unwashed between sessions. In extreme cases, rumors spread of photographers who took liberties with positioning or handling, seeking more dramatic poses. The line between respect and exploitation was thin, and not all honored it. These were the secrets spoken only in whispers, the moments when mourning turned to commerce. And in a world where even death could be staged, it became harder to trust what was real. What lingers today are those photographs, faded, cracked, but still haunting. They remind us of a time when people didn't turn away from death, but faced it, dressed it, and posed beside it. They reveal a culture that sought to hold on, even as breath left the body. But they also raise questions. What does it mean to remember someone this way? Were these photos tokens of love, or desperate attempts to freeze time? In the silence of each image lies the answer. Eyes closed, lips stilled, bodies at rest. Yet still they speak, and we, in looking back, become part of their final audience. Chapter 3: Death at Home. The living room was originally for the dead. before the cold, sterile corridors of hospitals became the final resting place for most. Death occurred in the most intimate of spaces, the home. In Victorian times, people did not die surrounded by beeping machines or fluorescent lights. They passed away in their own beds, wrapped in familiar blankets, under roofs where they had lived their lives. Once the final breath left the body, the home shifted into mourning. Curtains were drawn. Clocks were stopped at the moment of death. Mirrors were covered in black cloth. And in the quiet hush of grief, the parlor transformed. This front-facing room, meant to receive guests and display a family's refinement, became the viewing space for the dead. For days, the body would lie in that room, dressed, arranged, and visited by mourners. It was not yet called a living room. That would come later. For now, it belonged to death. The rituals surrounding a home death were intricate and steeped in superstition. As soon as someone passed, every member of the household had a role to play. Women began preparing the body, washing it, dressing it in funeral attire, arranging the limbs. This was done with both care and fear, as many believed the spirit lingered near the corpse for a time. Men would often be sent to notify neighbors or fetch the undertaker. Children were hushed and kept away. All clocks in the home were stopped to freeze time at the moment of death, ensuring the soul was not trapped in the cycle of the hours. Mirrors were covered to prevent the spirit from becoming trapped or confused. Even the family dog might be removed from the room, as animals were said to sense when spirits had not fully departed. The body remained in the home for several days. Depending on the weather and the wealth of the family, ice might be placed beneath the coffin to slow decomposition. Visitors came and went, offering condolences, delivering food, and whispering stories of the deceased. The home became both a sacred and social space, part sanctuary, part stage. Flowers filled the air with perfume to mask the scent of decay. Black ribbons were tied to doorknobs and fences to signal mourning. Neighbors would lower their voices when walking past. All who entered the house stepped into a place between worlds, where the veil of death hung thick and heavy in every corner. The parlor itself was arranged with precision. The coffin was placed prominently, often on trestles or decorative stands. Candles burned at each end. Family photographs might be placed nearby. Chairs were positioned for guests, who sat in silence or offered soft prayers. In wealthier homes, musicians were hired to play somber melodies. In modest households, hymns were sung from memory. The air was often thick with incense or the sharp scent of camphor. This was not just a farewell. It was a performance of grief, meticulously curated to show the community that the family mourned with dignity, respect, and tradition. Every detail mattered. Every ritual had meaning, but these rituals came with fear. Victorians were deeply superstitious, and death carried a kind of spiritual contamination. If a mirror was left uncovered, it might trap the soul of the deceased or allow death to reflect back into the room. If a clock was not stopped, it could confuse the spirit or invite another death soon after. Some families placed coins on the eyes of the dead to keep them closed. Others sprinkled salt near the doorways to ward off restless spirits. Even the direction the coffin faced held meaning. It was typically placed with the feet facing the door, so the spirit could walk out and not return. These customs weren't merely symbolic. They were survival tactics in a world where death was believed to have presence, agency, and power. After the viewing, the funeral procession began, starting at the very door where the dead had lived. Pallbearers would carry the coffin out feet first, ensuring the spirit did not linger or look back. Curtains remained drawn for days after. The house, now emptied of its guest of honor, slowly shifted back toward the living. But the transformation was never complete. The memory of the body, the presence of death, lingered, and over time, this constant overlap between life and death began to feel intrusive. People started to change how they viewed their homes. No longer just a place for grief, it needed to feel alive again. It needed to be reclaimed. In the early 20th century, attitudes toward death began to shift. Medicine advanced, hospitals grew, and death started moving out of the home and into institutions. But the memory of what the home once was still clung to certain spaces, particularly the parlor. This front room, forever associated with death and mourning, carried a heaviness that some families wanted to erase. As homes modernized, so did the language, and so, in an act both symbolic and deliberate, the parlor was renamed. It became the living room, a place, now, for conversation, laughter, and memory, not coffins and candlelight. The name was a rejection of death's dominance. But beneath the new title, the old shadows remained. There were other signs of this transition. Furniture was redesigned for comfort rather than formality. Floral wallpaper replaced dark paneling. Family portraits of the living took the place of mourning images. Yet, if one looked closely, many Victorian homes still bore the architectural traces of their former rituals. Wide doorways to accommodate coffins, long front rooms ideal for viewings, and decorative mantels where funeral wreaths once hung. The home had shifted, society had changed, but the bones of the house still remembered, and those who lived there often did too, even if they spoke of it less and less with each passing decade. Not everyone welcomed this change. Some believed that removing death from the home also removed intimacy. Hospitals, though cleaner and more efficient, felt cold and distant. The act of caring for the dying, of preparing the body, had been an expression of love. Now it was delegated to strangers. The rituals that had once helped people process grief were now reduced to paperwork and quick farewells. Even funerals became shorter, less personal, and the living room, though brighter and more cheerful, lost its depth. It became a place for entertainment, but no longer for remembrance. Something had been gained, but something was also lost. There were those who tried to preserve the old ways. In some rural areas, home deaths remained common well into the 20th century. Families still washed bodies, still laid them out in parlors. They clung to the belief that death belonged in the home, that it was a final act of love to prepare someone for burial with your own hands. These families passed down stories, rituals, and methods, treating death not as an enemy but as a familiar guest. But they became fewer and fewer with time. As the modern world pushed forward, the past grew quieter. The living room became a television room. The parlor piano was replaced with a radio. The dead were forgotten, but the house remembered. In Victorian homes, the boundary between life and death was always thin. One moment, the parlor held laughter, music, and conversation. The next, it was draped in black, lit by candlelight, and filled with whispers. The same furniture bore both joy and sorrow. The same walls heard final breaths and first songs. This duality defined the era. The Victorians did not fear death's presence. They made room for it, honored it, even decorated it. But over time, the modern world decided to lock that door, to turn the page, to rename the room and pretend it had always belonged to the living. But history doesn't forget so easily, and neither do the homes that once held the dead. Today, when we step into a Victorian-era house and admire its charm, we rarely think of what those rooms once held. We see the tall windows, the ornate fireplaces, the floral rugs, but we do not see the coffins that stood there or the families that gathered in tears. We do not hear the muffled sobs or the quiet prayers. We forget that the living room was once a place where death was met with dignity, a place where grief was real, raw, and present, not hidden away. And though the room has changed, its story still lingers, waiting to be remembered by those who care to ask what came before the laughter. Chapter 4: Superstition and Symbolism. The hidden codes of Victorian mourning. To understand Victorian death, you must first learn to read its language. A language without words, spoken through fabric, color, metal, and silence. The Victorians believed the dead were never far. Spirits lingered just beyond the veil, and the living walked in constant risk of offending them. That's why mourning became more than etiquette. It became a code of survival. One wrong step, one broken rule could invite something malevolent. And so, every gesture, every article of clothing, every letter sent after death carried a hidden meaning. From black envelopes sealed in wax to the way a mourner turned their head at the funeral gate, death had rules. And beneath those rules, superstition grew like ivy in the shadows. In this chapter, we step into that hidden language, a world where grief wasn't just personal. It was performative, secretive, and filled with ominous consequence if misread. A woman in mourning was watched, not only by society but by the spirits themselves. Her veil became her sentence. In deep mourning, she wore crepe, a coarse, rustling black fabric that shrouded her face for 2 years. Her clothing said it all. No smiles, no music, no jewelry with color. But as months passed, the fabric lightened. Jet beads appeared, then finally lavender, signaling a soul was letting go, but not completely. Widows were expected to embody grief, but it wasn't always voluntary. If a woman failed to mourn long enough, she risked judgment, not just from neighbors, but from the supernatural. Spirits might feel slighted, so the veil was more than cloth. It was protection, obedience, and a whisper to the world that grief still held its grip. Hair became memory, but not one kept in photo frames or letters. No, Victorians wove the hair of the dead into brooches, lockets, and rings. Some pieces were elaborate, braided, coiled, or shaped into floral designs, worn close to the heart. These mementos weren't just tokens. They were amulets. Each strand carried a piece of the departed's essence, a physical bond between worlds. Sometimes entire mourning wreaths were made of human hair and framed like sacred relics. It was intimate and macabre. For many, this was the only tangible thing left of a loved one, and it became a hidden message. The dead were not gone. They were worn into daily life, literally carried on the body, like whispers sewn into lace. Even letters of condolence followed rules shaped by superstition. Paper wasn't white, it was edged in black or fully black. The wider the border, the fresher the grief. Invitations to funerals were sealed in black wax, and envelopes arrived not by hand, but by messenger to avoid bringing misfortune through the front door. Every fold, every mark, every ink stain was calculated. These weren't just invitations, they were signals. When mourning cards were passed around, they might include symbols. An upside-down torch for life extinguished, a weeping willow, or clasped hands torn apart. These emblems silently told others how to behave. Speak softly, bow your head, avoid joyous chatter, and above all, don't ask too many questions. Homes bore the burden of symbolism too. When someone died, the family covered every mirror in the house. A mirror, they believed, could trap a soul, or worse, reflect death itself back into the world. Clocks were stopped at the moment of death to prevent time from stealing the spirit's path. Curtains were drawn not for privacy, but to shield the house from the prying eyes of spirits that might be passing through. Some placed salt on the windowsills, or opened them just after death to allow the soul a clear exit. These weren't just habits, they were sacred tasks. Forgetting one could mean a spirit lingered, confused or angry. So each room became a theater of precaution, and everyone in it became part of the ritual. Jewelry told stories without speaking. Jet, a glossy black gemstone made from fossilized wood, became the official mourning gem. A widow might wear a pendant of black jet carved into a coffin shape, or earrings shaped like urns. Others had lockets that opened to reveal the face of the dead. These pieces were both armor and confession. They announced to the world, "I am grieving, do not disturb." But jewelry also hinted at more secret meanings. A black ring engraved with initials might show alliance to a secret mourning society. Or it might be a quiet nod to a death that couldn't be mourned publicly. A child born out of wedlock, or a lover never acknowledged. Symbols bled into graveyards too. Victorian cemeteries became forests of coated stone. Angel statues with covered faces, broken columns for lives cut short, draped urns for sorrow, ivy for eternal friendship. Every grave marker was a message carved in cold marble. Even the direction of a grave mattered. East-facing for resurrection, west-facing for final rest. To walk through a Victorian cemetery was to read an encyclopedia of hidden grief. One might see a lamb and know a child rests there. A hand pointing upward meant hope. A hand pointing down, a life pulled away too soon. Death wasn't silent. It spoke in symbols. You just had to know how to listen. But not every symbol was used with honest intent. Some Victorians exploited mourning's codes for deception. Women wore widows' weeds to elicit sympathy or claim benefits from dead husbands who weren't even dead. Fake mourning jewelry was sold on the cheap. Cards with black borders were sent to scam donations. In a world obsessed with etiquette, appearances could be weaponized. One could feign deeper grief to shame a rival or avoid suspicion. Mourning became a costume, a role, and like all theater, it had actors who lied. Children were not exempt from the performance. They wore black armbands or ribbons, learned to lower their heads in solemnity, and were taught to avoid laughter during funerals. Even their toys followed the code. Dolls dressed in mourning, picture books about angels carrying siblings to heaven. Death was not hidden, it was folded into life. For a child in the Victorian era, losing a sibling was common. But forgetting them, that was forbidden. So memory became ritual, And every ritual, no matter how small, carried the weight of something bigger. When mourning ended, it didn't simply vanish. It faded bit by bit, a veil lifted. A bead changed from black to gray, card removed from the mantle. Yet many never fully returned to color. Some chose to wear black forever, not out of despair, but reverence. They feared what forgetting might bring, or worse, who might return if they dared to laugh again. For these mourners, life after death wasn't about the soul's journey. It was about living under its shadow. Mourning became identity, and stepping out of it was like walking into the light after years in a darkened room. Even the language of flowers carried secrets. Mourners used blooms to speak in silence. Lilies for innocence, marigolds for grief. Black roses, rare and dark as night, for eternal farewell. Floral arrangements at funerals were like coded letters, whispered across the casket. Some bouquets weren't left by family at all, but by strangers with unfinished business. A single wilted daisy might speak louder than words ever could. Flowers wilted quickly, but their message lingered long after the scent was gone. Victorian mourning was a labyrinth, and those who wandered through it carried the weight of tradition, fear, and devotion. Symbols weren't just decoration, they were protection. Against judgment, against madness, against the unseen. To grieve correctly was to keep balance between worlds. To fail was to invite chaos. Every veil, every brooch, every card and flower was a step in a silent ritual. And behind every ritual was a belief too deep to name aloud. That death wasn't an end. It was an observer, watching, waiting, just beyond the veil. Chapter 5: The Rise of Spiritualism, when the dead were invited back. It began as a whisper in the dark, a gentle knock on a table, a cold draft in an otherwise still room. In the grief-soaked world of the Victorian era, people longed for connection beyond the grave. They weren't ready to let go, not yet. And in that aching silence, spiritualism found fertile ground. At first, it was just a curiosity, an after-dinner game with neighbors or friends. But as more people claimed to receive messages from the other side, what began as entertainment took on the weight of truth. Death had stolen loved ones. Now, Victorians wanted them back, and some believed they could bring them. The séance became the centerpiece of Victorian mourning.
Curtin drone, quand le lit.
A circle of clasped hands. Families gathered in solemn hope, not knowing whether the room would fill with grief or something far more dangerous. Mediums led the way, promising safe passage across the spiritual divide. They claimed to channel spirits, speak in ghostly tongues, or write in trembling hands. Some sat still as furniture moved on its own. Others wept as invisible fingers grazed their cheeks. For the bereaved, these moments felt like miracles. But the deeper they reached across the veil, the more they risked pulling something else back with them. Spiritualism spread like wildfire, feeding on loss, guilt, and desperation. By mid-century, seances were no longer confined to drawing rooms. They moved into public halls. Mediums became celebrities. They toured across cities, performing before crowds who watched in stunned silence as tables levitated, trumpets sounded without breath, and glowing figures walked the room. These performances promised hope, but they also drew skeptics, scientists, journalists, even magicians, who accused mediums of using trickery, sleight of hand, and hidden accomplices. Still, the faithful didn't care. For those drowning in grief, truth was less important than comfort. The death of a child often pushed families into the arms of mediums. Victorian childhood was fragile. Disease struck quickly, and medicine was helpless. For grieving parents, the idea that a lost child might still exist, still think, feel, speak, was a balm for a wound that never closed. Mediums often claimed to channel the soft voices of little girls or boys. Messages were short, tender, always loving. But behind the illusion of innocence lay a shadow. Some mediums staged these voices themselves, mimicking a child's tone. Others used hidden assistants. And darker still, some did not control what answered their call. As seances became more popular, so too did the stories of spiritual dangers. Not every presence was loving. Not every voice came from heaven. Some seances ended with participants fainting, vomiting, or fleeing in terror. Mediums reported sudden seizures, speaking in unknown languages, or falling into trances they couldn't escape. These were dismissed by some as theatrics, but others whispered of real possession, of malevolent spirits, of forces that came when invited but refused to leave. The veil between life and death, once seen as a barrier, now looked more like a door, and it was swinging open too easily. Not all mediums were frauds. Some believed they were truly gifted. They devoted their lives to spiritual work, living modestly and claiming no profit. They held seances not for money, but for healing, for clarity, for the sense that love could transcend death. Yet even among the honest, there was fear. Spiritual communication was unpredictable. One never knew what might come through. One moment it might be a mother's comforting whisper. The next, a howling entity that made the candles flicker and the room grow cold. The spiritual world did not play by human rules, and once contacted, it could not be silenced. The church was quick to condemn spiritualism. Contacting the dead was viewed as dangerous and ungodly. But the Victorians were caught between science and superstition. Religion no longer answered all their questions. Yet science had no comfort for sorrow. Spiritualism filled the gap. It blended belief with evidence, emotion with spectacle. And while many turned away from priests and ministers, they gathered eagerly around seance tables. Faith was changing. No longer confined to pulpits, it now flickered in candlelight and whispered through knocks and moans in the dark. Parlor games turned into investigations. Entire societies were formed to study the phenomena of spiritualism. Scholars, writers, even doctors joined these groups. They sought proof that the soul survived death. Experiments were performed under strict conditions. Some mediums passed, others failed spectacularly. Still, the search continued. The hunger to prove the afterlife never faded. The Victorians were not just mourning the dead. They were chasing them, calling to them, hoping to touch them one last time. For many, the seance table offered more answers than the Bible. But not every seance ended peacefully. There were stories of madness, obsession, even death. Some believers became addicted to spirit contact. They withdrew from the world of the living, waiting for ghostly messages, refusing to move on. Children were raised in homes where ghosts were more real than neighbors. Some families fell into financial ruin, giving all they had to mediums who promised one more conversation with the departed. The line between comfort and exploitation blurred. and in some cases it shattered completely. Mediums, too, bore the weight. Those who were frauds feared exposure. Those who believed feared what they summoned. A few claimed to be haunted by their work, stalked by spirits who came uninvited. Others ended their lives in despair, saying they had opened something they could not close. The Victorian obsession with the afterlife brought with it a heavy price. The dead may have been gone, but their shadows lingered, and those who tried to reach them sometimes found themselves lost in the process. By the end of the century, spiritualism had divided society. To some, it was a sacred bridge between worlds. To others, a manipulative trick. But regardless of belief, its impact was undeniable. It changed how Victorians viewed death, not as an end, but as a shift, a transition, a door that could be opened if one had the courage or the desperation to knock. And so, the seances continued, hidden behind velvet curtains, flickering candlelight, and trembling hands. The dead had been invited. Some never left. In this strange and haunted chapter of Victorian history, grief became a key. And with that key, the living unlocked doors they were never meant to open. They reached into the dark, hoping to grasp the hand of a lost loved one. But sometimes they found something else waiting there, something older, hungrier. And now that you've seen how the dead were called back, the next chapter reveals what the Victorians feared most of all, that some of the dead were never gone to begin with. Chapter 6, Dead but Not Gone, Victorian Science and the Fear of Premature Burial. In the dim glow of a gas lamp, the true horror for Victorians wasn't death itself. It was waking up 6 feet underground. The fear of being buried alive haunted both rich and poor alike. It wasn't irrational paranoia. It was a real and reported phenomenon. Newspapers shared tales of claw marks inside coffin lids, bodies found twisted in unnatural positions, and graves dug up to reveal something far worse than death. As medical science struggled to define the precise moment life ended, Victorians were left suspended in terror. Could breath still linger in a shallow chest? Could a weak pulse be missed by an unskilled hand? In this fog of uncertainty, they didn't just bury the dead. They buried doubts, too. But some refused to leave fate to chance. For them, the grave would become a trap only if they failed to prepare. Inventors sprang into action, designing coffins that doubled as emergency devices. Some were fitted with bell systems, allowing the not-so-dead to pull a cord from inside the box. Others came with breathing tubes, flags that could rise above ground, or even glass panels to allow observers to see signs of life. The safety coffin industry became its own eerie niche. Patents flooded in. Some featured periscopes, others had built-in feeding tubes. Families with means purchased these bizarre contraptions out of sheer panic, hoping their loved ones or themselves would never have to use them. Yet, for all the ingenuity, one problem remained. What if no one was around to hear the bell? What if the graveyard was empty? And what if the bell tolled too late? Doctors were not always in agreement over what constituted actual death. There were no EKGs, no reliable machines to track brain activity. In some cases, the declaration of death came down to a cold body, pale skin, and a lack of visible breath. But what if those signs were deceiving? Conditions like catalepsy, epilepsy, and hypothermia mimicked death with disturbing accuracy. A person could be alive, frozen in place, barely breathing, while being examined by a physician. Misdiagnoses weren't rare. And in a time when medical training varied wildly, even a simple fainting spell could lead to a hasty burial. The truth was, death was often guessed more than confirmed. To combat this uncertainty, Victorian morgues introduced the chilling concept of the waiting mortuary. Here, bodies were laid out for days or even weeks until putrefaction set in. Only then would they be declared truly dead. Some waiting mortuaries came with staff specifically tasked with watching the corpses, ready to spring into action if signs of life returned. Others had complex pulley systems to raise an alarm. Families sometimes paid to have the dead watched for days, praying that decay wouldn't come, because if it did, it meant hope was gone. But while some cities embraced this practice, others saw it as morbid and impractical. The living still needed to grieve, and waiting mortuaries delayed closure. The lines between science and superstition blurred in these fears. Victorian literature echoed the terror with stories of entombment, paralysis, and burial alive. Poe's works weren't fiction to his audience, they were warnings. Fear bled into popular culture, stoking an already anxious public. Death was no longer a peaceful end. It was a gamble, a coin toss where the wrong call could seal you in darkness. This fear crept into the collective psyche. Funerals were rushed by the poor but delayed by the cautious. Graveyards became the final scene of unknowable tragedy. The corpse might look asleep, but was it? Even some clergy and funeral directors took extra steps to verify death. Pricks under the fingernails, incisions, bleeding tests. If a drop of blood surfaced, the body was assumed to still have life. Some even experimented with electrical shocks or burning candles near the face to detect faint breathing. These rituals, though rooted in desperation, only heightened the horror. Imagine a loved one being jabbed, prodded, shocked, and watched, just in case they might wake up. Death became an ordeal, and that ordeal, cloaked in science, was often more disturbing than the death itself. Yet not everyone trusted doctors or undertakers. For many Victorians, especially those in rural areas, the family took charge of death. They examined the body themselves. Some even tied the toes together or placed pins beneath the fingernails to monitor movement. A mirror would be placed near the lips to watch for fog. The dead were surrounded with superstitions and small tests that might confirm the soul had truly departed. But even then, there was doubt. Could something linger? Could consciousness remain trapped inside a still body? Such questions were asked silently with no real answers. The wealthy, ever fearful of misdiagnosis, began constructing family tombs with escape features. Secret trapdoors, ventilation shafts, and ropes were built into the stone structures. Servants were paid to stay nearby for several days after the burial, listening for knocks or muffled screams. It was a grim sort of insurance, an acknowledgement that science was fallible and fear was valid. These tombs became less places of rest and more emergency chambers. In their effort to avoid premature burial, the Victorians accidentally created monuments to paranoia. There were documented cases that fueled this fear. Inquests revealed coffins that had been clawed from within, corpses found twisted on their sides, broken fingernails, bloodied hands. The stories may have been rare, but they were sensational. They confirmed what many already feared, that burial was not always the end. Whether exaggerated or true, they left a lasting mark. No one wanted to be the next tale whispered in alleyways or printed in the Sunday paper. The dead, they realized, might not be as still as they appeared. Some argued that this fear was irrational, that the odds were too low to justify the hysteria. But in the Victorian mind, death wasn't about statistics. It was about control. In a world where disease struck without warning and doctors often failed, controlling the process of death gave people comfort. Safety coffins, waiting mortuaries, and cautious rituals weren't just precautions. They were acts of defiance, proof that even in death, one could be prepared. It was less about science and more about facing the void on their own terms. In the end, the Victorian fear of premature burial reveals more about their worldview than about medical facts. It shows a society suspended between progress and terror. They believed in science, but only just. They trusted doctors, but verified death themselves. They longed for certainty in a world full of shadows. And in that uncertain space between life and death, they built contraptions, rituals, and stories that haunt us to this day. Because in Victorian eyes, death wasn't the end. It was a doorway. And sometimes that doorway could swing both ways. What they feared most was not the grave, but waking up inside it. That horror, more than any ghost story or seance, haunted their imagination. The safety coffin wasn't a gimmick. The waiting mortuary wasn't just protocol. They were desperate solutions to a nightmare that no one wanted to face. And even now, when we declare death with machines and monitors, a piece of that old fear lingers. A whisper from the past reminding us that in the dark, sometimes the silence can lie. Chapter 7. The secret they took to the grave. The truth about Victorian corpses. They were buried, mourned, and remembered, but not always left to rest. In the shadows of Victorian cemeteries, another ritual unfolded. One not printed in mourning manuals or whispered in polite society. Grave robbing, a horror more common than anyone dared to admit. It didn't begin with malice, but with demand. Medical schools needed bodies to study, and no amount of paperwork or morality stopped the supply chain from forming. Under moonlight, shovels struck freshly turned soil. Men with sacks, hooks, and horse carts prowled churchyards, avoiding guards and watching families. Sometimes, bodies vanished before the family ever saw the grave. A closed coffin was no guarantee, no lock too secure, and the poorer the grave, the easier the theft. What began as a secret necessity soon became a profitable trade. The dead, no matter how sacred, were seen by some as nothing more than a commodity. The rise of anatomy schools fueled this black market. Doctors needed real cadavers to teach, and corpses were not easy to come by legally. The law permitted only the bodies of executed criminals. But that supply was limited, so medical institutions turned a blind eye when unmarked bodies appeared on their tables. Grave robbers, known as resurrectionists, made a living off the dead. They became experts in digging silently and quickly, often targeting paupers' graves or newly interred coffins. The bodies were stripped of identification, sold by weight, and dissected in secret. For the poor, this was a second death, a violation not just of flesh but of dignity. Even the church could not guarantee protection. Some burial sites were favored for how little resistance the ground gave. And with every transaction, another family unknowingly mourned over an empty box. The irony is that while the rich flaunted their mourning with expensive displays, the poor were most at risk of this post-mortem theft. Those without funds for sealed vaults or mausoleums were buried in shallow graves, often in overcrowded plots. Grave robbers knew where to look. They watched the undertakers, followed mourners, and returned after nightfall. In some areas, families took turns guarding the grave for days. Others placed iron cages called mortsafes over the burial site. Cemeteries tried hiring guards, but it wasn't enough. The fear was so widespread that newspapers printed guides on how to protect loved ones from resurrectionists. The final insult wasn't death itself, but the knowledge that someone could steal your body, cut it apart, and no one would ever know. And yet it went even darker, because not all of this was done for medicine. Some bodies were never dissected. Some were sold whole to private collectors, to artists, even to traveling exhibits. Victorian society had a fascination with the macabre. Human skeletons, preserved fetuses, and mummified remains became status symbols for some. A well-connected collector could acquire a body the way another might collect ivory or taxidermy. These transactions were even more secretive than medical dissections. They left no records, and those who profited had no shame because the dead could not protest. This was not science. This was indulgence wrapped in shadow. And once again, the poor paid the price. Meanwhile, a more organized form of body trafficking developed behind the scenes. Dissecting societies, formal clubs of surgeons, students, and physicians quietly funded the grave-robbing networks. They paid middlemen to acquire corpses, then paid again to ensure silence. Hospitals became drop-off points. Morgues forged death records. The entire system operated with a wink and a nod, protected by a wall of polite denial. Some officials even benefited from the trade. Laws were passed later to regulate cadaver supply, but for years this industry thrived in darkness. Those buried in obscurity could be exhumed, skinned, studied, and discarded, all without consequence. In urban centers, things were even worse. The anonymity of city life gave cover to more brutal practices. Bodies were stolen not only from graves but from homes. Poor tenants who died alone were reported late, if at all. By the time anyone came to collect the corpse, it had already been sold. Slums became hunting grounds for unscrupulous dealers, and the morgue attendants, overwhelmed and underpaid, often looked the other way. In some cases, entire batches of bodies went missing from charity hospitals. Families searching for their loved ones were told vague lies. Unclaimed bodies, they were assured, had been buried, but few ever checked. No one wanted to believe the truth. Even funeral directors were not beyond suspicion. Some took bribes to deliver bodies directly to anatomy schools. In exchange, they placed stones or wood inside coffins before burial. As long as the lid was nailed shut, no one would know. Other times, the swap occurred after the funeral. Mourners would walk away, believing their loved one was safe beneath the earth. But by nightfall, the corpse was gone. These were not isolated events, they were patterns. And they exposed a brutal contradiction at the heart of Victorian mourning. A society obsessed with honoring the dead had quietly built a system that consumed them. And it wasn't just adults. Children's bodies were also taken. The younger the corpse, the more valuable it was to surgeons studying growth and disease. Small coffins were easier to snatch, and the grief of parents was easier to exploit. Some grave robbers specifically targeted infants and toddlers. Their bodies were less likely to be missed by the system, less likely to trigger an investigation. In a time when child mortality was high, no one blinked at another small funeral. But behind the weeping veils, unimaginable horrors played out. In the quiet hours before dawn, tiny graves were violated by those who saw only profit. As the scandal grew, the public eventually fought back. Outrage led to riots outside medical schools. Families demanded to know where the bodies had gone. New laws like the Anatomy Act were passed to regulate body donations and restrict grave robbing. But even then, enforcement was weak, and black markets have always found a way. In secret, the trafficking continued. Simply became more cautious, more selective. The whispers faded, but the fear never did. Families still buried their dead with iron cages, armed guards, or secret marks to identify disturbed graves. Mourning, once a spectacle, had become an act of defense. The deepest horror is that many never knew the truth. Generations passed without realizing their ancestors never made it to rest. Some were turned into skeletons on classroom racks. Others became anonymous exhibits in private cabinets of curiosity. A few were tossed into unmarked pits after being used and discarded. No marker, no ceremony, just oblivion, and for what? A little knowledge, a little money. A secret history of violation hidden beneath the lace and black crepe of mourning. The Victorians built an empire of grief, but beneath its polished surface was rot. And this is the secret they took to the grave. Not just that bodies were stolen, dissected, and sold, but that the entire system allowed it. That the same society that wept so theatrically could look away when the dead were exploited. That beneath every grand mausoleum and mourning parade, there was silence about what happened next. This final truth reveals not just how Victorians treated the dead, but how far they were willing to go to pretend they didn't. The grave was never as final as they wanted us to believe.